Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
This is the British Broadcasting Corporation.
Fünf, zwei, sieben, eins, sechs, neun, acht, drei.
Well, who's our first letter from today, Edward?
An old friend of yours, Doris, Brian Hartley of Fontainebleau, asking what's being done to build up Anglo-Soviet relations.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic for you.
Welcome to episode 3 of Cold War Conversations, where we hear about the strange world of football in East Germany. And even if you're not interested in football, it is a fascinating chat. Craig McCracken runs the website beyondthelastman.com, described as 20th century football writing and nostalgia in a skilled and cultured groove. One of his areas of interest is football in the GDR. And from our conversation, you'll realize he is a font of knowledge from BSG Rotation Babelsberg to FC Hansa Rostock and all stops between. We talk about the nefarious activities of Stasi Chief Erich Mielke and his favorite team. And we also cover the only competitive game where the GDR played West Germany in the 1974 World Cup. Craig also describes a Stasi chase through the bazaars of Istanbul to stop player defections and the suspicious death of a former GDR player in West Germany. If you want to know more, there's some great videos and other links on our show notes page at coldwarconversations.com/episode and the number 3. I'm delighted to welcome Craig McCracken. So, hi Craig, how are you?
Hi Ian, yeah, very good, thank you. And yourself?
Good, thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about your website, Beyond the Last Man?
Well, certainly, yes. Beyond the Last Man is essentially, it's a ritual football writing and nostalgia site that I started back in 2012. And it has a focus predominantly on world football, but world football with a timeline more based around the second half of the 20th century. So really from the start of the post-war era through to maybe the beginning of the 1990s, really. Sometimes venture outside that time window, but the majority of the articles that I write about and my contributors write about tend to be within that 45-year window, really. So yeah, I like to write about players and teams and subjects that will be probably a little bit less known to modern football fans. That's the East German connection, obviously, there.
Okay. Well, I highly recommend to listeners to have a look at Craig's site. Now, obviously, you're here to talk about the football in the former East Germany. Now, what started your interest around that?
Well, it started back when I was a teenager and I first started going to football games. And I think when you grow up with football in Glasgow, you're very, very fortunate because you have Rangers and you have Celtic, and both of them play, or used to play at least, European club football every season. And I always loved European club football, and I was always very, very happy to go along to both grounds on big European nights to see the various visitors come to Ibrox and Parkhead. And so from quite an early age, I suppose I developed a real interest, a fascination when Eastern European clubs generally came, because there was an aura about them, a kind of mystique, a sort of sullenness, of a different political system. None of them seemed to smile, and they all seemed to have a disdain for us mere Westerners. So I was always kind of interested. I was always kind of intrigued, and as I grew older, I started to look a little bit more into the histories of these clubs and the stories behind them, and found out how fascinating they were, the politics and the machinations that went on, and just how much football in the Eastern Bloc was manipulated for political purposes, of course.
Oh.
And bringing this round to East Germany, of course, well, no other country's football probably operated within such narrowly defined parameters as was the case with East Germany. I think another aspect of as well my interest in East Germany, I think it's an element of nostalgia as well, of course, because I think we tend to romanticize and venerate what's gone, and East Germany has gone, although its clubs remain in some form or another. The East German football and the East German Oberliga system obviously disappeared in 1991, and so I think I probably look back through slightly rose-tinted glasses now, in the way that I wouldn't necessarily do with football in Bulgaria or Albania, which carries on to this day, albeit in a slightly different form.
So, Craig, how was East German football organised then? What are sort of like the differences that we would have seen versus, you know, how Western clubs were organised?
Well, the short answer is messily, and the long answer is much more convoluted than that.
Well, let's have a bit of the long answer, right? I'm intrigued now.
Bit of them. Okay. Well, I mean, I think one of the fundamental differences between football in East Germany and most of the rest of Europe, certainly Western Europe as well, was how the sport was viewed by the state. In Western Europe and much of Eastern Europe as well, it was always viewed as a force for good. And I think there was always a trepidation by the East German state, or the SED party, to ever really embrace football, because there was worry about its popular appeal. And of course, there was always an uneasiness about mass gatherings in one space, and thousands of people coming together in football grounds gave scope for potentially dissenting voices to be raised as well. And then I think quite significantly was football being a team sport, and being subject to the vagaries of individuals and luck, and for the reasons that we love the sport. I think that was a problem, because it was a very difficult sport for the state to weaponize for propaganda purposes.
So there wasn't. Did they use doping, like to the level they were using in athletics?
Well, no, absolutely not. I mean, within athletics and swimming, there was a strong, obviously a powerful state-funded, state-driven program, and it was very pragmatic. It was very scientific. The Olympics were seen as the most valuable sporting outlet, and in terms of being able to, I think very much is in the way that the British team has done successfully in recent years, targeting sports in which they felt they could win considerable amounts of medals, and concentrating the doping campaigns in those. And I emphasise, obviously, Britain has done that through its funding, and picking sports like shooting and the equestrian events that they could focus on and get some success in. So I think the Olympics was always top of the tree for these German states, because it could be. And there was a lot less focus on football, because they realised it was much more difficult for them to succeed. So doping was insignificant, I think, within the East German state, because there was no real need to, basically, because it wasn't really felt that it could bring great success because of strategy and tactics and technique. Doping can't really improve that.
And you mentioned, the worry about dissent at the football stadia. Have you seen, found any evidence of sort of, of clubs or of the crowds at clubs using a football ground to be able to voice dissent sort of anonymously?
I think that started to occur much more commonly during the 1980s, and I think that came with dissatisfaction with the regime growing, of course, and within the footballing context as well, dissatisfaction with BFC Dynamo's dominance, which was obviously corrupt, obviously referee influenced as well. So I think before Erich Mielke and the Stasi really took a grip of the East German game and basically made the Oberliga title the exclusive domain of their favourite club. East German football was I'd hesitate to say it was open, but the honours were shared around, and football was seen as a force for good by supporters. But I think by the 1980s, as BFC Dynamo recorded corrupt title win after corrupt title win, I think it mirrored the very decline of the state itself. And so there was a lot of dissatisfaction, particularly amongst supporters in Leipzig and Dresden. I feel that the kind of big city clubs who had enjoyed some success in the past, as they saw that there was very little point in them being there, because they knew that their clubs couldn't win. Yeah.
And so there were different types of club then? There were a number of different sort of categories of club, were there?
There was, yes. I mean, there were very few. Nobody could just set up a club as a free club. Every club had to be associated with some organ of the state. Virtually all teams. There were the occasional exception, like Sachsenring Vicar were an unusual exception, but virtually every club were associated with an industry or some sort of government ministry. And I think part of the joy of the naming conventions of East German clubs is you could see a club's origins from its prefix that it carried. So obviously everybody recognises Dynamo as being the club of the interior clubs of the interior ministry. So you had Dynamo Berlin, obviously, and Dynamo Dresden, and many other smaller Dynamo clubs as well. Vorwärts they were army clubs. The activist clubs were related to mining. Clubs prefix of tractor were involved in the agricultural sector. Rotation was one of the more interesting ones, which they were clubs that were affiliated to the print industry.
Okay, and I, obviously one of the teams I've heard of is Locomotive Leipzig. Was that anything to do with trains?
It was indeed, yes, and they were part of the railway sector. And again, it kind of mirrored the nomenclature that was common across much of the Eastern Bloc, because there were locomotive clubs. There was Locomotive Moscow that still exists today and are still a force. Locomotive Sofia in Bulgaria. So there was about half a dozen significant clubs, and they even used to run a Railways Cup where the railway clubs of Eastern Europe would get together and play off in one of these manufactured competitions. I think that used to run in the 1970s. I couldn't tell you whoever won them off the top of my head, to be honest.
Oh, it's a shame. I was going to ask you that question. Oh, that's really interesting, the way that the clubs were set up. I think I read somewhere also that a number of clubs actually moved locations as well.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we'll probably talk a little bit about Vorwärts Berlin, who were probably my favourite, in retrospect, my favourite East German club. And I mean, they were the army club, and they were the dominant club. They were the BFC Dynamo of the 1950s and 60s, whereas they were repeated champions. And they had, again, quite an interesting but a very, very typical history. Football in Berlin in the early 1950s was underrepresented and poorly represented. So the shortcut that was taken was to basically just import a successful team from elsewhere in the country. So Vorwärts came in from Leipzig or from Dresden, from one of the two anyway. Their team was imported lock, stock and barrel and renamed and made to be Vorwärts Berlin. And they then played with some success, as I say, in the 50s and the 60s. And they probably, the peak of their powers was roughly 1969, 1970, when they reached the quarterfinals of the European Cup. And then in 1971, typical East German fashion, a decision was made that the smallish town of Frankfurt-Oder on the Polish border needed a football club because their previous team had been disbanded. So Vorwärts Berlin were shifted. They were moved out and renamed as Vorwärts Frankfurt-Oder. And they ceased to be any sort of significant force after that.
So it's a bit like, being a Rangers fan, let's say, and then suddenly your club is moved to Birmingham.
Well, if I could give maybe a slightly slightly better example, it would have been, say, for example, when Rangers went bankrupt in 2012 and had to start again down in the fourth tier of the Scottish game. And so they started with a new team. They bought in a new team, but it would have been like if Rangers had decided that who's quite good? Well, Aberdeen have quite a good team, so let's just move Aberdeen to Glasgow and rename them as Rangers, basically. So and this was very common. This happened a lot. BFC Dynamo themselves started in 1953 on that basis. They were basically a Dynamo Dresden team, and they were relocated back to Berlin. And actually, it was one of these instances that the players were quite happy, because all of the players were Berliners in the first place who had been moved out to Dresden to form a Dynamo Dresden team as well. And
I presume in a country like East Germany, the fans aren't really going to make much of a protest about that.
Well, I think it became ingrained within the culture as such. Really, there was a hierarchy of clubs, and everybody knew it, and it was tolerated to an extent. And I think it was tolerated to an extent when there was still a sense that other clubs could have success. And over the years, before BFC Dynamo took over absolute control of the East German game, starting from 1979. I mean, in the early 1970s, Magdeburg and Kaunas Jena were the forces in the East German game, and both of those clubs reached European Cup Winners' Cup finals. So while there was a sense that other clubs could at least compete, then that was seen to be, it was tolerated. But I think that compact was broken somewhat once they realised that it was BFC Dynamo and the rest.
Yeah. So you mentioned that your favourite club is Vorwärts Berlin. Why choose that one, Craig?
Well, I mean, there was not much glamour going on within East Germany at all in the 1960s. But certainly in the footballing sense, Vorwärts represented that to an extent. I mean, they were a state club. I mean, let's not hesitate to mention that. And when you're a state club in any Eastern Bloc country, that confers upon you many, many advantages. So when East German players, footballers, had to do their military service, for example, they were tended to be conscripted to play for Vorwärts Berlin, and which gave them advantages of all the best young talent in the country who played for them. And many of them, once they came to the end of their 2 years of military service, actually enjoyed playing for the club because it was a club that played progressive football at a time when East German football was seen as technically not very advanced and very functional. And they played quite good, quite exotic, quite foreign football in many ways. So the club was actually quite popular with other supporters because they were enjoyable to watch, really. So they kind of occupy the kind of role of East Germany's team of the 60s, and they were regulars in the European Cup, and a fascinating history behind them, and how they came into being was fascinating. And then, of course, as I described before, how they went out of existence, at least under the name of Vorwärts Berlin. They continue to play on as Vorwärts Frankfurt Oder, but
so
again,
they don't exist now, or are they amateur side or?
Well, they exist in some form. I think the club is now called 1FC Frankfurt, still based in the town. And they've undergone so many mergers, so many name changes that any element of the original Vorwärts Berlin DNA within them has barely exists at all.
A bit like how a Wimbledon fan feels about MK Dons.
Yes, probably considerably more diluted than that. But yeah, that's quite a good analogy. Well, what was really quite, I mean, the stories around the kind of enforced moves were quite interesting as well, because the greatest opposition when it was decided that the club had to move. You basically couldn't move as far away from Berlin in East Germany as the Polish border, and the main source of resistance to this move was actually the players' wives, because the when they visited Frankfurt Oder for the first time, which was a small town of 30,000, 40,000 people perhaps. And there was absolutely nothing there. There was nondescript place.
And Craig, I don't think that influence has changed even now with where players decide to sign.
Well, absolutely. But and again, it seems odd to our ears, but the players' wives enjoyed being in East Berlin because East Berlin was very cosmopolitan compared to.
Well, it was the shop window of the GDR, really, wasn't it, facing the west there?
Well, absolutely, and being footballers and being footballers' wives meant that they had access to the supermarkets with imported Western goods as well. So okay. There were certain privileges, and there was nothing of that ilk in Frankfurt Oder. So yes, so they led the vanguard of resistance to the move rather than the players themselves. So.
You mentioned about BFC Dynamo and their. I think you phrased it as their dominance of the German Oberliga. So obviously you mentioned the fact that they grabbed, or Mielke grabbed all the good players and moved them to the side. Were there any other influences that sort of helped them win the league or win games?
Well, certainly. I mean, the history of BFC is a curious one because Mielke's involvement with the club went right back to the formation, which was essentially in 1953. And what he wanted to do with the club, they were originally founded as the Berlin Sports Club Dynamo. And it was an organisation for the employees of the Ministry for State Security and the People's Police, which is a mouthful, and obviously in the East German capital. And essentially it was modelled on the Dynamo Moscow club in Russia. And that occupied exactly that same function, but for the KGB. So again, it was replicating the kind of state functions from Russia, as was common right the way across the Eastern Bloc. And a year later, 1954, he transplanted the Dynamo Dresden team to try to create a strong team in a hurry. There was no nods towards team building and the likes then. It's just import another successful team. But there wasn't really much success for the club. In fact, I think in 1957 they were even relegated. And they were still called Dynamo Berlin at that stage. And it was in 1966, as I mentioned before, when a number of clubs broke away to become dedicated football clubs. That's when they became BSG Dynamo. And even at that stage in their history, they'd won one cup, but never won the league, and Vorwärts were the dominant club. But I think his policies tended to change in the 70s, really, and I think there were a number of reasons for that. It rankled with him to an extent that many fans in East Berlin were fascinated by football in West Berlin. So many of them followed on their shortwave radios the fortunes of Hertha Berlin, for example. And that was a source of great irritation. And he wanted to build a super club, an East Berlin super club, that could be seen to be an equal of the clubs that he was starting to see springing up around Europe. Steaua Bucharest in Romania, CSKA Sofia in Bulgaria. These were clubs who were gaining international traction. And when you have traction like that, then you have good publicity and you good PR. So I think he wanted an equivalent in East Berlin. Right.
Is there any evidence that he was sort of putting pressure on officials to, fix games?
Well, that certainly did come about. I mean, I think he was not a man to ever really leave things to chance. And the last championship before BSC started their run of dominance, I think was 1978, and would it have been won by Leipzig? I think it was won by Leipzig. And infamously, he is said to have walked into the dressing room at the end of the game, where the Leipzig players were celebrating, and said to them, "Enjoy the celebration because this is the last title you'll ever win." And it was the last title they'd ever win. And there's certainly clear evidence of referee corruption. And in a subtle way and in a more overt way. The subtle way was tended to be because obviously East German referees were called up to referee games abroad, internationals, European club games, and that was considered to be a great honour, and it was a great privilege because it was a rare opportunity for these officials to be able to travel outside East Germany. But of course, to get a visa for that, they had to go to the Stasi because the Stasi issued the visa. So I think there was this kind of unspoken knowledge that if they made decisions that were displeasing to BSG Dynamo, that they would mysteriously find out that they weren't being granted visas and the privilege of travelling abroad as well. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, there was one of the most famous incidents was, I think it was the 1985-86 season, and it was BFC and Leipzig were in close competition for the title near the end of the season, and they played each other in Leipzig, and in what was essentially something of a title playoff. Leipzig were leading 1-0, and near the end of the game, the referee sent off Locomotive's captain for no real apparent reason. I think he ran out of a defensive wall before a free kick could be taken. Something quite simple anyway. And then with the final whistle looming, BFC striker fell to the ground in the penalty box with no Leipzig player anywhere near him, and the referee awarded a penalty. And Dynamo scored, drew the game, and ended up winning the title by 2 points. Wow! But there was such an outcry. It was a near riot at the ground that day, and I think there was an understanding then that there was corruption, and that had crossed the line for everybody.
I don't suppose there's any film of that game. Is there on YouTube anywhere?
There is actually yes. If you go onto YouTube, you can find footage of the game. So
right. Well, I will add that to the show notes and and provide the link to that. That will certainly be worth watching. How did BFC Dynamo do in Europe? Did they do? Obviously, they wouldn't be able to influence referees in that way.
No, well, yeah. I mean, that was it was, and again, it would have been. I'm sure it would have been a source of great annoyance to Mielke, because by the 70s and 80s, very much all of the talented young East German players were tending to end up at BSC. So I mean, they had a strong team anyway, even without the corruption element in the domestic game. But they made very little inroads at all into European competition. I mean, obviously they played in the European Cup 10 years in succession, and I think they maybe reached, off the top of my head, I think the furthest they reached was the quarterfinals, and I think it might have been the season that Aston Villa won the European Cup in 1982. And I think BFC Dynamo, they defeated them on the way. And in fact, BFC Dynamo won at Villa Park, which was a great result. So they won 1-0. But they had already lost the first leg 2-0 at home, so they still went out.
Yeah, I think I saw that they lost to Bayern Munich as well in one.
Yeah, there was one year
which they must have really rankled Mielke.
Well, what was quite annoying was that other East German clubs did make some inroads into European competition. I mean, Magdeburg, most famously, they won the European Cup Winners' Cup in 1974. And Karl Jena reached the final in 1981, and they lost to Dynamo Tbilisi. And the third and final European finalist was Leipzig, Locomotive Leipzig in 1987, and they lost to Johan Cruyff's Ajax team again in Cup Winners' Cup final. So, but BFC Dynamo never even reached the final. So,
the irony, the
irony, indeed, yes.
Were other clubs favoured by senior GDR figures? I'm sort of like envisaging, Erich Honecker and Mielke having a couple of beers and arguing the merits of their various teams. But do you know of any affiliations that the other leaders had to clubs?
Well, I don't think there's any great knowledge of Honecker having interest in football at all, really. I mean, I think I think Mielke was an exception in many ways. I think most of the senior members of the SED party, really genuinely had very little interest in the sport. Beyond what could be extracted for good publicity from it, and hard foreign currency as well when there was European ties to be played. But certainly one of the larger than life political figures of the East German history was a fellow who went by the name of Harry Tisch, and
was he the trade union leader?
Well, that was one of his roles. Yes, he became head of the Free German Trade Union Federation in the mid '70s, and he was in that role probably right to the end of his the time when the wall came down, obviously.
Yeah.
But he was Rostock based, and he was involved as an assistant at the time to another politician called Karl Mewes, and they were involved with the creation of what became Hansa Rostock, which in typical East German fashion was a relocation of another team called Empire Lauter, and just brought in wholesale and said, right, you're Hansa Rostock now.
I'm running out of paper to make notes here now.
And so that was in 1954. But Tisch went on to become the SED district first secretary in the Rostock district. And so he was very influential with the Hansa club. He was notorious as a heavy drinker, and he gained some degree of infamy in the mid-1970s during a game. I guess could have been at Kali Icena, I think, and Hansa Rostock went 2 goals down within 20 minutes, and he drunkenly stormed into the dressing room and ordered his coach to make substitutions that he demanded right there and then. His coach refused and was sacked on the spot.
Wow!
And that sounds the sort of thing that you see from Italian club presidents today, and that's very much the case. And although obviously there was huge interference in football, that type of interference on a match day setting and things was almost unheard of. So yes, Tisch was a larger than life figure, and he came to obviously a very sticky end post-Berlin Wall as well, when his various corruptions from his background caught up with him. And he went to jail. He was the first Politburo member to be tried in unified Germany for corruption charges.
Right. I hadn't read on his final demise, but I'll have to have a look into that as well. Now, I just want to move away from the East German League for a moment and talk about the 1974 World Cup match, GDR versus West Germany, because I don't think we can miss that out. And I found a great quote online that apparently the GDR billed this as the triumphal march of GDR sport and the certainty of victory in the class struggle with West German imperialism. Now that's a soundbite and a half, isn't it, Craig?
Well, I mean, yeah, you can go to town on that one, and admittedly the States went to town on that victory. It was a very unexpected one, and in the grander scheme of things, it was utterly irrelevant because obviously West Germany went on and won the World Cup itself, kind of thing. But I think there was great stock played in that being the one major competitive game played between the nations. And
so were there friendlies?
Germany had
Were there friendlies?
There wasn't friendlies. There was. I did read an interesting article about this some years back. There were several other games played. But I think Olympic qualifiers, less significant games,
right? But
games played behind closed doors, and ones that don't seem to be recorded in the record book, certainly as far as the East German states concerned. But they undoubtedly hang their hat on that particular success. But yes, I think the coverage of the 1974 tournament was suddenly dwindled as the longer the tournament went on, and but by the time of the final, I think there was very little of it was actually even being shown officially within East Germany. But of course, many people could pick up television signals from the West as well, so they were hanging on, and there was West Germany's victory was greeted with popular acclaim amongst football supporters in the East. They supported the West as well in that sense, which would not have gone down well with the SED at all.
Yeah. And so what the goal scorer for the GDR was Jürgen Sparwasser. What happened to him? Did he? Well,
he if I remember off the top of my head, Sparwasser was an unusual one, because there was obviously a long history of players who defected from East Germany, and he didn't as a player himself, kind of thing, because he stayed loyal to the state for whatever reason. And I mean, he was a star midfielder who played for Magdeburg, starting from about the 1960s, I think. So by 1974, he was at the peak of his career, and he played on to the late 1970s. But he had options, and he had opportunities to defect to the West. And there was talk that he had been rewarded for his goal because of the huge propaganda coup that it brought. But I think it was all a myth. I think people had suggested that he was given a house and he was given a car and given cash, and I don't think any of that actually happened at all. And then oddly, just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think it would have been about 1988, he was allowed to travel to West Germany to play in a veterans tournament, because by that point he was oh goodness, he would have been about 40. So obviously his active career was long over. And at that stage he defected, and it was quite unusual, because most of the defections tended to come from players who knew they would have the opportunity to earn good wages in the West. And
so were there many player defections? I mean, I'm presuming this was when they were playing European matches away. They take that opportunity.
There were. I mean, the defections from many of the Eastern European states became a growing problem, and even for East Germany, despite the hugely strict control that was exerted over the players by the Stasi minders, then there was a history of defections. Yes, I mean, one of the most fascinating stories I think was came in, let me see, 1976, and it was a East German under-21 team, and they were playing in Turkey. So after the game, they were flying back the next day, and they had the morning free. And as a reward, the officials decided that the players would be taken to one of the grand bazaars in Istanbul to do a little bit of shopping. And so they were wandering about, and a couple of the players, and those players off the top of my head, Jürgen Pahl, and who probably isn't so well known, but another player called Norbert Nachtvey, who was a defender, and he became very known because he became the star defender with Bayern Munich during the 1980s. But they had hatched a plan to try to defect. So they had some shopping, and they made an excuse why they had to drop behind the party. They said they left their shopping in one of the bazaars. So they kind of wandered off, and then ran off down alleys, and then the Stasi minders realised that they'd ran off, and a chase sequence ensued. And the two players made their way to a taxi and headed over to the US Embassy. And from the US Embassy, they were passed on to the West German consulate. But then for the next 10 days, every night they were moved from different location to different location, because the combined spy agencies of the whole Eastern Bloc were out in force trying to find out where they were, to intercept them before they could be transported to West Germany. But as it was, they reached the West, and they were granted asylum. So Yes, defections were the closer we got to the fall of the Berlin Wall, then defections became a big issue.
I would have thought they'd had the same problem with match officials as well, to some degree.
Well, I think for match officials there was less motivation. I mean, match officials tended to be older. Right. There was not money to be made being a match official in the West. So possibly, if they had other vacations as such, but most of the players who tended to defect, and that's why Sparvasa was unusual, because at that point he was 40 and he was married. But the players who defected tended to be young. They tended to be players who weren't married, so they didn't necessarily have the strongest of familial connections back home, because they knew that the families would be persecuted in their absence, really. Yeah. And when players are young, they're foolhardy and they're brave and they're willing to take the risks that the older players and officials, for example, in their 30s and 40s might not be brave enough to do. Yeah.
Okay. It's really interesting. I hadn't necessarily thought of it in that way. What happened to GDR football after the wall came down? Presumably they merged some of the teams into the Bundesliga, or were there playoffs, or how did that work? I mean, that must have been quite a quandary for the Bundesliga as to what they were going to do.
Well, it was. I mean, it was a problem, and the DFB, the West, what was obviously the West German Federation at the time, they took a very long view towards this, a very positive view of what needed to be done to create unity, and I think it very much mirrored the general attitude of the West German states towards what needed to be done, and there was an understanding just how moribund everything to do with East Germany was, and how much money would have to be poured into reconstruction, and how there would be a cost that people would have to suck up for many years to develop the East like that. And so I think it was slightly comparable with football, because there was an understanding that these clubs from the East would undergo, I think it was going to be a very difficult transition, because these were clubs who were state-funded entities. They'd never really had to cope on their own. Everything was financed by whatever ministry or organ of government supported them. And suddenly they were going to be beholden to the capricious nature of free market economics and find their own money and their own sponsorship and discover capitalism, basically. So a fairly benign approach was taken. I think it was felt that to just consign all of the Oberliga clubs into the lower divisions of the Bundesliga would alienate supporters in the East. So the last season was the 1990-91 season. So based upon the final table that year, the top two teams, which were Hansa Rostock and Dynamo Dresden, they were given direct entry into the Bundesliga the following season. The next six clubs in the Oberliga table, they went into the second Bundesliga. So at that point was regional north and south. So they were divided up between them. And the rest of the division were put into the third tier of the Bundesliga. So again, that was divided into three regional groups. So it was a very positive, I mean, on pure footballing merits, those clubs wouldn't have necessarily deserved to enter in at that level. But I think it was a very clever approach to about trying to get the East German game on side and try to help it develop and catch up that the DFB took. Not that necessarily it helped in the long run, but
somewhat ironic again that a Stasi club, Dynamo Dresden, with the fall of the wall, gets promoted into the top tier of the Bundesliga.
Yes, well, I mean, Dynamo Dresden always were seen as basically the Mielke's second club, if you like. They were historically almost like a feeder club to BFC Dynamo. But I mean, at least there's some irony that Dynamo Dresden have. I think they're playing second in the second Bundesliga at the moment, and they have enjoyed a much more successful post-Berlin Wall existence than BFC has, for example. So so there's some irony in that, at least.
Yeah, because because obviously you mentioned that Vorwärts Berlin or Vorwärts Frankfurt or whatever they're called now have been so diluted they almost they aren't the same club anymore. How many of these GDR clubs still exist? I mean, obviously you've mentioned Dynamo Dresden, and it sounds like BFC Dynamo still exists in some form. Are there any others that are still there?
Yes. I mean, I suppose you could, if you look at that final Oberliga table, you could break down the clubs into the ones who exist, continue to exist and play under the same names, the ones that continue to exist but play under different names, and clubs who we have lost. So you have Dresden, as I mentioned, Hansa Rostock is still there, Rot-Weiss Erfurt, Kaunas Jena, Magdeburg, Energy Cottbus as well. In fact, Energy Cottbus were the most recent Eastern team to play in the Bundesliga. I think in roughly 2009 would have been the last time. Leaving aside RB Leipzig, of course, which is a totally different entity.
Is that a manufactured side, that, or?
Well, it is, yes. I mean, they're Leipzig-based, of course, but yes, they're a club that's only really came into existence in the last 6 or 7 years or so, really. And they were based upon a minor club called Markenstadt, if I recall. And yes, so they're a manufactured club. They didn't obviously exist in Oberliga times, really. Yeah.
So are there no former GDR clubs in the top tier anymore? Or currently?
Not at the moment. I mean, you had Hansa have been in several times. They've had a few runs. Dynamo Dresden were in for the first 4 years. They stayed in for 4 seasons when they were first put in post 1991. Leipzig. What was Locomotive Leipzig? They changed their name to VfB Leipzig or VfL Leipzig, which was the pre-war Leipzig,
right?
So long before communism, which had been greatly successful. But then they realised that most of their brand value existed with as Locomotive. So they went bankrupt in 2004, but reformed as Locomotive, and they continued to play as Locomotive. And as I say, Energy Cottbus, who had a couple of runs in the past decade. But you've had some others, like name changes. What was Chemie Halle is now known as Hallischer FC. Obviously, Karl-Marx-Stadt, the town itself, changed its name to
back to Chemnitz.
That's right. So the football club became Chemnitzer FC. So yeah, and there's the clubs we've lost as well. Still Brandenburg went bankrupt in 1998, I think. Stahl Eisenhüttenstadt bankrupt in 2004, and they finally became defunct a couple of years ago. Sachsen Leipzig, which is another, Leipzig was the cradle of German football after all, but Sachsen Leipzig was another club that they folded in 2011, and there's reformed clubs that are all in an unseemly scramble to try to appropriate their name now as well. So it's all very messy.
Yeah. Well, I was reading that BFC Dynamo have got a bit of a struggle over their club crest because somebody bought it. They allowed it to go out of copyright or something, and somebody bought it, and they've had a bit of a struggle over getting that back. Yeah,
well, it's they've been consumed by the kind of capitalism, which they've been struggled to adapt to. It's been a common problem. It's been a problem we've seen in Bucharest with their major army club Stoia as well. That's had similar problems in recent years. But I think people now that what they tend to associate BFC Dynamo with exclusively is the hooligan far right supporters, unfortunately. So it's a club that maintains a bad reputation, albeit for very different reasons now than in the past.
Well, Craig, that's been really interesting. I did have some other questions for you. I was interested to know if you had any GDR or Cold War items you've collected down the years.
A few bits and pieces. I mean, I have a Vorwärts a Berlin pin badge, which my girlfriend very kindly bought me as a birthday present a few years ago. So I'm very attached to that. Apart from that, I have bits and pieces of kind of modern replicas, I suppose. So I have a replica of that, the beautiful Karl Marx Stadt 1976-77 strip. And if you haven't seen it, it's a strip you need to look up, because I will
we will look that up. That sounds very enticing. Could you just try and describe it?
Oh, well, I will contend it's probably the most beautiful strip any football team has ever worn in the history of football. So I'm probably overselling it a little bit, but yes, it's a very iconic kit, and you can purchase it in replica form. It's essentially it's pale blue and white, and it's halves, if you can imagine a strip in halves, but it's diagonal halves. So it's but you have to look it up. I don't think my mere words can do it justice.
We'll put a link on the show notes to that. That sounds really enticing. So is that your most prized item? It must be the badge your girlfriend got for you.
Oh, it's definitely. I'm definitely going to go with the badge. But yes,
very sensible. Very sensible. Is there anything else you're still hoping to collect? Like a Vorwärts Berlin away shirt, or?
Well, I such a thing doesn't exist, unfortunately. So I would be. I have seen on eBay some original kind of tracksuit type tops, like training tops, and the likes on German eBay before, but the price is horribly prohibitive, because or they're very old items now, of course, really. But I mean, I think just yet another aspect of Eastern European and specifically East German football that I adore is the iconography and the graphic design that went into the club badges, and I love all of that stuff. And so there was a lot of merchandise created, a lot of items, and none of it sort of tacky, todgy type of stuff that we tend to associate with Western European clubs. So there's some beautiful bits and pieces, particularly in terms of badges and pennants and the likes. And of course, it's like piecing together a jigsaw, because you'll find this club name that you go, I've never even heard of that club before. And then you'll find out that it's actually a club that you know very well, but it was this particular iteration was something that it was called for 6 months in 1964, and then they decided to change the name again.
Wow!
As most East German clubs went through multiple name changes and mergers and the likes, really. So trying to piece together the history is incredibly complex, but also unduly rewarding as well, I think.
Yeah. Well, as I said at the start of the podcast, your website, beyondthelastman.com, has some great stories about some of the individual East German clubs. There's one called Robotron, which I think was the East German computer manufacturer.
Well, that's Robotron Samada. Yes, that was a guest post. I had again tended to attract a lot of guest posts from people who are interested in Eastern Europe, and there was a colleague called Rick Joshua who runs a Bundesliga site, and he's a big expert on German football generally. And this is a piece about the unusually named Robotron and Robotron Samada, who were an obscure club with an obscure history, but a wonderful name and a wonderful badge.
A question I was going to ask you is, I think we've probably talked about quite a lot about what people might not have been aware of about the GDR. But is there anything else that you've sort of found in your research that you thought, wow, I never really knew about that? That's really unusual.
Well, I mean, moving away from football a little bit with this one, I mean, as the old saying, the old adage goes, that even a stopped clock is right twice a day. And I think one aspect of East German state, East German culture that I found quite interesting was that it was fairly progressive with the promotion of the rights of women, gender equality generally. I mean, I think it was always pragmatic. I think there was an understanding that a realization that when over half of your population are women, that it made sense to a resource there to be mined. So I think the consequence, obviously, women proved to be a feature of the workplace at a level that was unheard of at the time in the West. And in terms of the kind of social support that went on in kindergartens and maternity benefits and access to abortion that women had at a time when even today many women don't have those kind of rights. And again, there was promotion of children, many youth organizations to embolden children and get them organized. And again, this was to political ends, but there was still a benefit to be had from it.
Yeah.
Of course, the gender equality only runs so far, and I mean, it was driven by economic imperative more than any other reason, and it was almost unheard of course, to see women on the workplace in management positions, for example, and you would never ever see any women in the upper reaches of the ruling SED party,
unless you're Erich Honecker's wife, of course. But there you go.
Well, then you hosted dinner parties and you went and hunting chips.
Well, I think she was Minister of Education, wasn't she?
Well, I suppose
Margot. I think she was anyway. I think she did have some sort of position there. I mean, it's interesting you're talking about that. I mean, were there any women's football teams?
Well, it's a good question. Not that I'm aware of, but I couldn't state definitively one way or another, to be honest. But I can't say I necessarily have ever encountered them now.
Sounds like a new area for research, Craig.
I'll leave that for somebody else's site.
Okay. Yeah. Another guest writer can cover that. Okay. Now, I did have a few other questions, which are sort of like semi-fun ones. And if you were a filmmaker, what Cold War incident or event would you recreate on film, and why?
Well, it would be a toss-up between two. I think one that we talked about, which was the Jürgen Pahl and Norbert Nachtvei running down the dark alleyways of Istanbul bazaars.
Oh, it'd be a great chase scene, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, it sounds like there's a Bourne film waiting to be written around that. In fact, one of the Bond films was set in Istanbul, wasn't it? It had an opening chase sequence in Istanbul.
Yeah.
I can't remember which one, but so I mean, that is a fascinating story in itself. And the other one, considerably more sinister, was the life and death of Lutz Eigendorf, who, if your listeners aren't aware, he was a central defender who played for BSG Dynamo, and he was reportedly one of Erich Mielke's favourite players. And he defected to the West, which caused Mielke great fury. And so he was being followed by day and night by Stasi agents, as happened to any player who defected to the West. And Eigendorf was, unlike most of the defectors, he was a player who didn't keep his mouth shut. He spoke out about what went on in the East and about the abuses and about how corrupt the system was. And I think that obviously angered the powers that be, the powers that were, even more so. And so he was playing with Eintracht Braunschweig, and I think this would have been 1983, and he died in a car accident when his Alfa Romeo went off the road and crashed into a tree. And it was deemed to be an accident, but and there's never been a definitive smoking gun one way or another, but there's a huge amount of anecdotal evidence to suggest that it was a death that was staged, if that's not too strong a word, by the Stasi, using by jugging his drink, and then knowing he'd be driving home, and then by using this headlight flashing technique they had to blind drivers on the road and encouraging to. There's a lot of confusion behind it.
That's interesting you mentioned that story, because I've recently read a story about a similar incident where the Stasi drugged a US military liaison team that were in East Germany. and they invited them to some party, or they offered them some drinks, and the dosage in the drink was set to cause them to have an accident, and then they would have been arrested for drunk driving, and they wanted to make a big deal out of it. So very similar sort of modus operandi, let's say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, post-unification, when the Stasi files were revealed and the extent of Mielke's operations against Eigendorf became public knowledge, and they included details of possible ways of killing the players, and of how best to kill him. And again, anecdotal stuff, but there was documentation showing that the supervising officer in the case received a large cash award on the night of his death. And
right,
and again, there was testimony from the people he had been drinking with, that he had one small beer that night, and yet the amount of alcohol found in his system. So again, it's a fascinating story, albeit a very, very tragic one.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting. I'll try and find some detail on that and add some links to the show notes on that.
Of course.
So if you're making a film about the Cold War, how about a soundtrack? Have you got any music that you think would be a good soundtrack?
Yeah. Well, for whatever reason, I mentally picture the Cold War, I always put it in a 1970s setting. I don't know why that's the case. So when I view anything through a 1970s prism, whether it's growing up in grainy Glasgow, or anything east of Berlin in that era, I think cold, I think grey, I think austere, and I think concrete, actually, very, very concrete.
Yeah.
So I suppose musically, the pieces I would look towards for such a project would be musical pieces that tend to invoke that kind of atmosphere, really. So I suppose I'm thinking things like Joy Division's Insight, Underpass, maybe by John Fox, The American by Simple Minds, Mr. X by Ultravox. All songs that kind of capture that kind of chilliness, if you like, of the era, or at least my perception of that era.
Yeah, no, brilliant. I like those. We'll have some links up for those. People can hear those as well. Are there any books in English that you could particularly recommend for anybody interested in GDR football? I'm laughing here because I'm thinking there's probably not many books in English about GDR football.
Well, there is one definitive one.
Brilliant.
And it's a book that's written by an author called Alan McDougall. And the name of the book is The People's Game, Football, State and Society in East Germany. I'll happily email you that link if you get it after. Now, this book came out a number of years ago, and it came out in hardback form.
I'll be looking at that. That sounds like one for the Christmas list, Craig.
Oh, it's a great read, yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. And so what, I was going to say, what's your most prized book? And this doesn't necessarily need to be about GDR football. I mean, if you got a particularly prized book?
I think if I adapted that to become what would be my Desert Island book, I suppose I would say, well, in footballing terms, it would be David Goldblatt's The Ball is Round. And it's essentially a 1,000-page or so historical opus that covers absolutely everything to do with the history of football. But there are some GDR books that I am very fond of as well. There's John O'Coller he's written a number of books, but one of his that I wrote that I really like is a history of the Stasi.
Yep, and I've got that one.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Yep, The Untold History of the East German Secret Police, I think it goes under the title. And also Frederick Taylor's History of the Berlin Wall. It's called the Berlin Wall, 13th of August 1961 to 9th of November 1989. And
yeah,
that's certainly as good a history of the Berlin Wall as I think I've ever read.
Great. Okay. Well, I'll put up some links to those. And lastly, is there a film or TV series that you've seen that you think is a good factual or fictional representation of life in the GDR?
I'm very fond of The Lives of Others, which came out 10 years ago, or 2007, I think. Yeah, and to any of your listeners who haven't seen it, I'm sure most of them will. It's a Stasi-based story about a Bohemian couple. He's a dramatist and his wife's an actress, and they fall under the attentions of the Stasi, and that's one of the senior officers is assigned to a surveillance case against them, and he slowly starts to become submerged in the lives that they lead, and it's absolutely fascinating story. And also, I think another probably slightly lighter film from, I think this one's from 2003, Goodbye Lenin.
Yes,
and that's absolutely great fun. It's such a wonderful premise for a film.
No, I'd agree with you with that one. And Life of Others is an amazing film, and particularly the ending, I think, is really powerful as
very
well.
Poignant, very poignant indeed, really. So yes, yeah.
Both of those, I would affirm that recommendation. Yeah. So, Craig, if people want to find you online or communicate with you further, where's the best place to find you?
Well, my website, as you mentioned, is beyondthelastman.com. That's all one word. So that's where most of my writing exists as well. But I'm fairly active on Twitter at BeyondTLM. And just as a little side project, I also run a Vorwärts Berlin Twitter account, which is
where I found you.
Which is where you found me. And again, it's a kind of a little indulgence project, really, but it was just to try and keep the name of a former great but now defunct club alive, and just gathering up bits of memorabilia and nostalgia, match tickets and pictures of the club in action and images of the players and the likes, really. So yes, you can find me there as well.
Okay, Craig, it's been a joy. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Okay. Have a good time. Have a good day.
Right.
Cheers.
Thanks. See you. Bye. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our interview with Craig. If you'd like to view some of the videos we discussed, there's links in the show notes at coldwarconversations.com/episode and the number 3. That's coldwarconversations.com/episode and the number 3. Don't forget, you can join our discussion group on Facebook. Just search Cold War Conversations. And we're also on Twitter at Cold War Pod. Thanks for listening. And if you like what you're hearing, please leave reviews with your podcast provider. See you soon.
This is the Voice of America, Washington, D.C., signing off.